Today, we are talking about the history of the Charlotte Mason Archive. And I am interviewing Dr. John Thorley, who was the last principal of the Charlotte Mason College. John, before becoming the principal of the Charlotte Mason College, was head of a comprehensive school in the northern part of the Lake District in Carlisle, England. John, how many students were in that school?
Actual school students, it was 1,750, but it was also a community school. So the school was responsible for what we call the adult education of half of the city of Carlisle.
And you have also, when you left the Charlotte Mason College as principal, you became a professor at Lancaster University, or was that at the same time?
Yes, I actually became professor of education while I was principal of the college. All the principals of the colleges within the Lancaster University ambit were given the title of professor.
Ah, okay.
So I've been professor of education ever since.
So what are the courses that you have taught at the University of Lancaster?
That I actually taught myself.
Yes.
Well, of course, I taught within the college. The college, Charlotte Mason College, was at the time independent financially, but we were academically validated by Lancaster University. So our courses led to a B.Ed degree or PGCE of Lancaster University. My own teaching within the college was fairly restricted. I did some history teaching, but I always, because my history is entirely in schools, I was always involved on teaching practice. Always, at every teaching practice, I had 2 or 3 students that I looked after, so to speak, on teaching practice around the schools of Cumbria and North Lancashire. Now it's quite different, because now, ever since retiring from the college, I've still continued to teach, actually at Lancaster, but I've now reverted to being a classicist. So I've taught, I'm still teaching a course on medieval Latin at Lancaster University. This is for MA and PhD students. And I've also taught, believe it or not, medieval Greek to some students as well. So I've returned to being my original subject, and indeed my doctorate is not in education, it's in Greek and Latin.
So you are what is typically referred to as a classicist, right?
That's right, apparently, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So that gives us a little background about John. John also was one of the first speakers at the first CMI Charlotte Mason Education Conference. Has a wealth of knowledge about Charlotte Mason, her history. And so today we want to talk about how the Charlotte Mason Archive was established. And I understand, John, that there are several stories about the establishment of the Mason Archive that include the story of the PNEU Archive, the Mason Archive. Tell us those stories.
Well, it is complicated, and in preparation for this session, I have tried to piece together where things were when. When I arrived at the college in 1983, of course, the college by that time was fully a part of the national system. The fact that it had been established by Charlotte Mason was simply a part of its history. We were not, by my time, actually teaching Charlotte Mason methods. We were fully a part of the national system. But of course, I was interested in Charlotte Mason as an educationist, as most people in the college were. I discovered soon after I arrived that there was a considerable archive in various places. We had some of the archives actually in college, but they had been transferred to the Armitt, which was then actually in Ambleside Library. It wasn't the modern building that there is now. The college had transferred what the college had of the archives to the Armitt in the Ambleside Library. So that was one piece, so to speak. The college no longer retained, well, we retained a few of books that Charlotte Mason had owned, and they're still there. So that was one part of the archive. Another part of the archive was in what was by then called the PNEU WES. That's the PNEU stroke World Education Service, based in London. They were still providing schools, mainly overseas schools, with materials on Charlotte Mason lines. That eventually closed in 1988 or 9, I think it was. They in London had an office, and they had essentially what were any records that were still relevant to the PNEU. And I was aware of that. And in fact, when the PNEU WES closed in 1988-89, I went down there with a large van and collected the archives that they didn't want to hand on to anybody else. So, of course, we weren't particularly keen on the materials that they had been dealing with in recent years. But we got anything before about 1960, anything that they possessed. We brought it up to Ambleside. Now, I discovered then, that was 1988, I discovered then that the PNEU WES, based in London, had already handed on some of its archives, the older archives, they told me, to London University. And as far as I knew, in 1988, that's where it still was. So when I retired from full-time principalship in 1994, we knew where the Armitt section of the archives, the college piece, and what the Armitt already had, that was in the Armitt. Then we had the material that I had brought up from London, from the PNEU WES, but we were aware that we thought that there was another section that had been handed on to Lancaster, to London University. I contacted London University, 1994-95, to ask if we could have them, please. And they, after several months, a letter came back saying they had no record of them in their present collection. I then discovered, I'm not quite sure through whom, but through someone else, that London University, we don't know the exact date, around 1985 apparently, had handed the archives that they had received from PNEU WES to Kendall, to the Kendall Record Office. And what I didn't know at the time, Kendall Record Office, because I contacted them to ask what they'd done with them, they couldn't find them. We then discovered sometime later that they had actually handed what they had received from WES, World Education Service, they had handed it to the Armitt. So actually by 1994, all the material was in the Armitt. Unfortunately, it wasn't all in the same place. So when I started to catalogue the archive, there had been an attempt, by the way, around 1980 by the county archive service to catalogue it, but they had not got very far. So when I started to catalogue it in 1994-95, I knew the location of most of it, but I didn't know where the section, which was actually, those who work with it will know it, these are the PNEU boxes. They had apparently been handed to London University, then back up to Kendall, and then to the Armitt, but I had never seen them. By accident, one day when I was elsewhere in the Armitt, down in the bowels of the Armitt in the basement, I saw some boxes that were simply labeled PNEU boxes. Lo and behold, they were the boxes that had been handed over by London University to Kendall, then from Kendall to the Armitt, but nobody had recorded the fact that they had been left there. But as soon as I looked in, of course, I realized what they were. So I can be assured, I'm assured now that we do have everything. The whole archive is together in the Armitt, and the catalogue that I did, I hope, covers all the archives available from Charlotte Mason today, certainly. That's rather a long story. I'm sorry about that. But that, I think, is the situation now. The catalogue that we did and that Deanie and her colleagues then digitized is, I think, the whole archive, certainly on Charlotte Mason herself, up to 1923 when she died.
Just so that our listeners understand, Kendall is on the edge of the Lake District, not very far from Ambleside, which is where the Mason House of Education was and where the Armitt is now, just so people understand that. So there's this, to me, it's an interesting story about the Mason archive. I'm curious to know why you made the decision to go to the trouble of getting that archive together. Why not just get rid of it?
I have to say that I suspect the thought did occur to me, because there were in total by then, without the PNU boxes, which I didn't know at the time, when I started the process, there were, I think it was something like 80 archive boxes. Now, an archive box is a considerable box, cardboard boxes, and there were about 80 of them. And as soon as I looked into one, I realized that there was little organization of the papers that were in. I consulted a friend of mine who was an archivist. I've always had an interest in archives, so that's probably part of the answer I should give. I'm interested in archives. So I just spoke to a friend of mine from the Kendall Archive Office, and I said, how do I deal with these things? Do I try to reorganize them into some sort of topics? And he said, oh, no, don't do that. Certainly not nowadays, because we now have computers. All you need to do is record each item in each box, where it is, exactly where it is. Don't move it. Put it on your computer, and then it means that it can be word searched, and that is the state of play still. Everything is as it was. Everything is in the same box that it was in when I started the process in 1994. Now, some of the boxes are coherent, of course. In some, there are coherent materials. Charlotte Mason's letters from here to there, and so on. But in many, it isn't like that. There are 30, 40 items, which could be, frankly, anything, and they are listed exactly as they were in the box. And put on my computer, and that's of course the origin of Deanie's digitized system, so they can be searched for quite simply on a computer. Now that's really, I realized that the cataloging that had been started around 1980 was incomplete. I think the story there was that one of the archivists had been asked to do it, and she had moved on to another job, so the job was simply left. So it was only about half finished, and I decided to start again because I thought there were better ways of doing it. So it's my interest in archives, and the fact that, of course, I knew about Charlotte Mason. I knew something about her at this time, not a lot, I have to admit, but I knew something about her, and I thought that whatever she had written, whatever materials were still available to research her history. And I knew, of course, several of the researchers who had been doing research, Margaret Coombs and several others at the time. And I thought these must be both preserved and also organized in such a way that other people can get access to them.
So I know you don't like the praise, but we are looking at the gentleman who made the archive possible, because if you hadn't made the effort and gone through the trouble of going to London and the various sites to gather the archive together, such as Kendall and London, we wouldn't have it today. Somebody else may have thrown it away. But we are forever thankful to you, John Thorley. So let me ask you another question. What do you think might be significant about Mason's work?
Well, from my ideas at the time, I knew something about Charlotte Mason's educational ideas, but as I said, I hadn't read everything that Charlotte had written at that stage while I was principal of the college. I knew something about her as an educationist, because, of course, in a sense, she is part of part of educational history. But what I did realize was that many of her ideas are now there firmly embedded in the British education system, in primary education especially. Her ideas about the importance of the child, and about the importance of a broad curriculum, the importance of science and other things in the curriculum, all those are there in Charlotte Mason, and those have fortunately been built into our primary education system over the decades since Charlotte started to talk about those things. When you realize the huge difference that she made, look, when you go to a museum today in England, you often see a schoolroom as it was around 1870 or something, they will claim. And when you see what they were doing, of course, what Charlotte herself did down in Worthing, she had to do it because the curriculum was set for her. Essentially, what they did was the so-called 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, together with a bit of girls sewing and boys a bit of woodwork. And that was pretty well it. Or run around the playground and so on. And that was what the curriculum was. And Charlotte, by 1880s, when she wrote Home Education, she was saying it shouldn't be like that at all. We shouldn't start with what the curriculum is. We should start with what is the child. And I knew enough about Charlotte Mason at the time to know that her ideas, many of her ideas, not all, but many of her ideas, had become thoroughly a part of British schools as I knew them, because I did teach briefly in a primary school myself. I knew that those ideas have been incorporated in so much English education that you see today in schools.
So I want to change topics just a bit. At the north end of Ambleside on Ryder Road, going out of town, is where, toward Grasmere and Rydal, is where Charlotte Mason had her college. She, I think, purchased the building from Wordsworth's niece and changed the name. I think it was called Green Bank when Wordsworth's niece lived there. But Mason changed the name to Skelhow, which is a hill. Howe means hill. And the building, Skelhow, sits on a hill, but right across the road at the bottom of the hill is a home now called Springfield. Still has that name today. It's called Springfield. How does that fit into Mason's story?
Well, when she started in 1892, in January 1892, that's where she started. She rented Springfield, which is where I lived for 11, 12 years. So that was the beginning of the college. She started, as you probably remember, with just 4 students. That first year was just 4 students. And they were based at Springfield. And what later became my sitting room was where Charlotte started the college. She was there until I think 1894. And then she first rented and later bought. She rented what is now Skelhow. Then it was simply the white building that you see on top of the hill. It was later, of course, there have been many extensions since then, but it was the white building that she first of all rented, realizing that by that time I think she had 30 students, so that she couldn't fit them all in Springfield. She retained Springfield, which is why I was able to eventually use it as the principal's house. So that's what Springfield was. It was the first college.
So you were, correct me if I'm wrong, you were the last principal, and for our listeners, I want to distinguish that in the States, a principal of a college is called president of the college, and I think it's the same in Canada. they refer to their college principals as presidents, as we do. You were here in the UK, even to this day, you are referred to, if you are the leader of a college, as principal. Can you share just your experience as the last principal of the Charlotte Mason College?
Yes, when I went there in 1983, the college was, as far as student numbers were concerned, it was in a dip, because there had been how can I put it? The teacher education in this country has always been manpower planned. That is, the government gets an idea from the birth statistics, how many teachers are required, how many new teachers are required each year. In the early 80s, the population had dropped, the child population had dropped, and therefore the number of teachers allocated, so to speak, to each training institution in the country, 100 more as there were then, had been reduced. And the result was that Charlotte Mason College in 1983 had only around 200 students. But when I was appointed, the point was made that the expansion was now going to come very rapidly because the birth statistics had changed. There was more teachers had retired than they thought. So there was a sudden need for primary school teachers especially. And after 3 or 4 years, by the way, also secondary teachers. That's why we expanded into secondary teacher training. But when I arrived, the numbers were just over 200. And then within the first 3 or 4 years, the numbers of students on the BEd program was somewhere in the region of 500. So we had to expand extremely quickly. It reached around 700 full-time BEd students by around 1988, 89. So the expansion from 83 to 89 was very, very rapid. So we had to find not only teaching rooms for them, several places were rebuilt or new buildings put up. We also had to find accommodation. We built several accommodation blocks. We also found accommodation in various places in Ambleside and Windermere. We also made this arrangement with Lancaster University, which is 25 miles away, that most students would spend 1 year, that's the second year of the 4-year course, they would spend the second year actually at Lancaster University, doing whatever subject they were specializing in. So that made it possible to expand so rapidly from 200 in 1983 to around 700 about 6 years later. So a lot of the day-to-day work was involved in setting up those different things, the arrangements with Lancaster University, who was our validating body, as I've mentioned. So most people, the only exception were the people doing outdoor education as their specialism. They stayed in Ambleside, but all the other students in each year group went to Lancaster for 1 year, that is for their second year. We also expanded it, as I said, into the secondary field. We did secondary PGCEs in several different subjects, including modern languages, French mainly. We also, in that context, we developed a link with 6 French universities. What we did, we ran a joint postgraduate certificate in teaching French, in English schools, that is, with a French certificate for teaching French in further education in French colleges. This was a dual qualification, which took a full year. Students arrived in September, and they didn't finish their qualification until the following August. So it was more than the academic year. And that was, they spent 6 months in France. They spent 6 months in a London college. We hired premises in a London college to do that course. So that was, it was suggested to us actually it was suggested to me personally by someone I knew at the Department for Education and Science at the time, who said we must expand the number of teachers teaching French and other modern languages in our secondary schools. Can we in any way contribute? So I said, well, yes, almost certainly. So we had 50 students each year taking that 1 year course for French. But we also did secondary courses in English, in religious studies, in history, and one or two other subjects. So we expanded into the secondary area as well. But that was just 1 year. The students were there for 1 year. But the other big expansions for us was the fact that we realised Ambleside is a village. I mean, it's only 2,000 population. And the college population was already, that is the full-time students, already 700 plus. And we decided that an area where we did have expertise and we could almost certainly contribute to the national pattern was in-service education for teachers. So we were able to expand there, partly because at the time, in the expansion of students, of course, together with that had gone expansion of staff. And the expansion of staff was mainly primary, some secondary specialists, of course, but mainly in the primary field. And by that time, by 1987, 88, we had 6 former primary school heads on the lecturing staff of the college. And we decided that that was an opportunity. So we specialized in management courses for running primary schools. That was for head teachers and deputy head teachers. And it was extremely successful because we were able to run these courses, not necessarily in Ambleside, only a few of them were in Ambleside, for Cumbria Education Committee, for several other education committees in the country, including 2 London boroughs. We actually sent people down to London to run these courses. Over the year, they would go down for a week and then come back to college and do some other work. And then 2 or 3 months later, they would go down and teach for another week. And we did that in several locations, including not just London, but the Isle of Man, little island between us and Ireland, which does not have a college. So we got the contract to teach, to do the in-service training for teachers on the Isle of Man. We also got the contract to teach teachers, give in-service courses to teachers who were in English forces schools overseas, because there are still English schools for forces personnel, Army personnel, Air Force personnel, in Germany, in Cyprus, and at the time there was in Hong Kong. So we were delivering courses, some of our staff were delivering courses in Germany, in Cyprus, and in Hong Kong. So the total of the in-service work that we were doing was actually 1/3 of the college's work. 1/3 was in service, and the other 2/3, well, not quite, but most of the other 2/3 was initial teacher training. We did a few other courses as well, because we moved into courses, for instance, for tourism, because, of course, Cumbria is a tourist area. So we were asked by the tourist board if we would be able to provide courses for the management of tourism. So we had to buy in people to deliver those courses. So that's how the college expanded very, very rapidly in those years between 1983 and 1988, 89. That was most of my job. I was also, by the way, regularly in France, because I speak French. And I was regularly negotiating how we were going to split up the money between ourselves and the French universities, the 6 different French universities in France. And by the way, 2 other colleges joined our system. The Homerton College, Cambridge, and Nottingham University also joined us in that scheme to provide modern language teachers in English secondary schools by using this system of giving students 2 qualifications, one to teach in English schools, another to teach in French colleges. And it was, as I said, a full 1-year course. It was very popular. Each year, we had, by the way, we had 25 French people and 25 English people each year on that course. And there was never any problem in recruiting students for it. We regularly got 100, 150 applications for that course. So it was a very successful course. I enjoyed the teaching that I did on it too. So that was my job.
So back to the archive, do you have any stories or any final thoughts about the archive and the collection and the...
Well, the fact that Deanie and her team at Redeemer College at the time. Deanie was there near Toronto. Digitized most of the collection. Not all, there's still some to be done. I gather Deanie wants to complete it. That has been invaluable. That does mean that the archive is going to survive. I mean, it will survive in physical form. We have had advice from the archivists on how to preserve the material, because some of the materials, of course, are already 150 years old in the archive. So we did get advice on what to do to preserve the materials that are in it. 80 boxes full, not all as old as that, but some of the material, as you've seen, Carol, you've seen some of the letters from Charlotte Mason from the 1860s, 1870s. Those are very, very fragile now. So they've all been properly preserved. And there's no doubt that the fact that they're now digitally available means that the archive is going to survive for, I hope, many hundreds of years from now on.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, John, for taking time out of your day and your week to tell us the history behind the preservation of Mason's archive. We appreciate that very much, and we hope that this video will remain around for many, many years as a historical record.
I hope I've got it all right, Carol. I'm working from memory for much of this, as you realize.
That's okay. You have a good memory, much better than mine. All right, so thank you, John. We appreciate you joining us today.
Okay, right, Carol.